Hello class. Today my group and I will be presenting on chapter 20, which covers globalization and protectionism. In chapter 20, section 1, we cover a lot about protectionism. So protectionism is basically when a government legislates policies to reduce or block imports. These policies often seek to shield domestic producers and workers from foreign competition. So three forms of protectionism are tariffs, import quotas, and non-tariff barriers. Tariffs are taxes that governments impose on imported goods and services. It discourages imports. Import quotas are numerically limitations on the quantity of products that a country can import. An example, when President Ronald Reagan served as the 40th President of the United States from 1981 to 1989. He and his administration imposed a quota on the import of Japanese automobiles. The third form of protectionism is non-tariff barriers. They represent other ways a nation can draw up rules, regulations, inspections, and paperwork to make it more costly and difficult to import.
In this graph, we see that Brazil has an equilibrium price for sugar of 12 cents per pound, and the equilibrium output's 30 tons when there's no trade. And in the US, the equilibrium price is 24 cents per pound, and equilibrium quantity is 80 tons. Now, when there's free trade, profit-seeking firms will see an opportunity to buy the sugar cheaply in Brazil and then sell it at a higher price in the US, which would result in the quantity produced in Brazil to be greater than the actual demand or the consumption in Brazil, and vice versa for the United States. Now, sugar farmers are going to argue for protectionism at this point, which they will claim would be higher domestic sugar production, more jobs, and the American sugar farmers would receive a higher price. Now, instead of saying no trade, the U.S. could pass a import quota saying that they'd import no more than 7 tons of sugar, which would result in the price of sugar in the U.S. being 20 cents demanded. And in Brazil, since they can only export only 7 tons of sugar, their import price would be, or sugar price rather, would be 14 cents per pound.
Does international trade result in fewer jobs? No. NAFTA reduced tariffs, import quotas, and non-tariff barriers to trade between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. In result, next 6 years, the United States economy had some of the most rapid job growth and low unemployment in its history. Critics claimed it would encourage U.S. companies to move to Mexico because of cheap labor costs. Another question is protectionism saving jobs, and how much does it cost? Well, protectionism may save jobs, but the costs are high. Saving a job through protectionism typically costs much more than the actual worker's salary. Protectionism saves jobs in the specific industries being protected with tariffs, but it cannot save unprotected ones. Average job in the textile and apparel industry would cost $199,000 per job saved.
So this is the third part, which is about arguments in support of restricting imports. And first of all, we have the infant industry argument, which is basically about helping new businesses with their production. And they give them indirect subsidies to get up and running and conquer already well-established businesses. And this method may not always work, but some nations, such as Japan and South Korea, have tried this method to get their domestic steel and auto industries up and running. So we have proof that this works, but it might not be suitable for everyone. And then we have the anti-dumping argument, which basically is laws that block imports that are sold below the cost of production by imposing tariffs. And this makes it easier for buyers to purchase from local producers, because importers, if they can't conquer with selling below the cost of production, they might not want to import at all. So that's the basic idea of this method. And then we have the environmental protection argument. And this is, I would say, easier to understand because an increase in import lead to pollution, because we have freight, of course, and if you have an increased number of import, then it might or it actually increases the scale of production, which makes the total volume of pollution and environmental damage to increase. So this is an argument to protect the environment, basically. And yes, that's the third part.
All right, so a little bit about history on international trade. The number one organization that oversees trade is the World Trade Organization. However, here's a little bit more in depth about the World Trade Organization. So after the Great Depression and World War II, countries wanted to tie all into one, like they wanted to create something that would tie every country into each other. So what they did was they had a convention and they had an idea and created. They had three ideas. One idea was the World Bank, which was created to help people in their native countries. The second idea was the Monetary International Fund, I believe it was called. And then the third idea was to have a national trade organization, which would help basically control the trade nationally for everybody instead of natively. So the once the people, all of the nations that were initially invited to the meetings did not agree upon the formation of that trade, the National Trade Organization. So 27, what came out of that was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or AKA GATT. 27 nations signed this agreement at the convention held in Geneva, Switzerland. And what this was it was a forum in which nations could come together to negotiate reductions in tariffs and other barriers for trade. And they would oversee all types of markets once this was created, because there isn't the same type of market everywhere in the world. So they oversee everything, and there are a lot of other like smaller organizations that they oversee. To name a few, APEC, which is the Asia Pacific Economic Corporation, the European Union, NAFTA, which is the North American Free Trade Agreement, and things like those. Those are all kind of who they oversee and who they are control of. And those big things all make up the one big World Trade Organization. So yeah, a little bit about that.
The trade-offs of trade policy. Over time, the average person gains from international trade. The average person is the trade-offs of trade policy. Over time, the average person gains from international trade. The average person is a hypothetical representing a mix of those who have done very well, those who have done all right, and those who have done poorly. Common belief among economists is that it is better to embrace the gains from trade than it is to cut off trade. Deal with the costs and trade-offs with other policy tools. Disruptive market change is when you innovate new product or production technology which disrupt the status quo in a market. The status quo is current situation or how things are now. And when you maintain status quo, that means that you keep things the way they presently are. When this change, the innovators earn more income and profits, and the other firms lose income and profits unless they come up with their own innovations.
There are a few costs associated with the 10% tariff on steel, one of them being higher steel prices. Protectionism is a simple method of requiring consumers to subsidize producers. The subsidy is indirect since consumers pay for it through higher prices rather than a direct government subsidy paid with money collected from the taxpayer. Another cost is that consumers have less money to spend in other industries. With that being said, jobs are lost in unprotected industries. There was a reduction in U.S. real income of $1.4 billion per month in deadweight loss and costs U.S. consumers an additional $3.2 billion per month in added tax. Another cost is that a firm sells a protected product to other firms so that other firms must now pay a higher price for a key input and those firms will lose sales to foreign producers. In essence, protectionism reshuffles jobs from industries without import protections to industries that are protected from imports but does not create new jobs.
Slide 11 is about the benefits that are associated with the 10% tariff on steel. Due to this tariff, there has been a creation of several thousands of jobs in the steel industry. It is estimated that this new tariff will add roughly 19,000 jobs to our workforce. There is a balance of the foreign subsidies and protection of American metal producers. For those who understand the steel industry, it's clear that the Trump administration's steel tariffs have generated a boom in steel investment and a shift to newer technologies that are creating high-paying jobs for thousands of new steel workers. Another benefit is restoring national security. They imposed tariffs on foreign steel after a Commerce Department investigation determined the metals posed a threat to national security by degrading the American industrial base. The reasoning behind the tariff was to protect the interest of national security. American steel companies experienced boosted production and elevated prices. The tariff was able to provide American businesses with more revenue, which led companies to succeed. The new tariff had a positive impact on the American steel industry.
The steel tariffs should be kept because it was greatly beneficial for the American consumers and the government. If we look at the numbers, the tariffs did create several thousand jobs in the U.S. steel industry. Also, the tariffs on washing machines are associated with approximately 1,800 new jobs at Whirlpool, Samsung, and LG factories in the U.S. And it benefited the government because it reduced our dependency on China. However, our presence in the Asian market did decrease as a result of tariffs and leaving the TPP. We propose that keeping the tariffs and rejoining the TPP would be another great counter to Chinese economic influence. It would result in cheaper American and Asian goods, improve labor standards in some of the Asian countries that are in the TPP, such as Vietnam, Singapore, Brunei, which would help shift the dependence from China to other Asian nations that are our allies. On top of that, it would create stronger ties with our allies, and it would help bring back skilled jobs to the U.S. If we look at how the TPP was performing when we were a part of it, Made in America exports rose by nearly 50% and contributed a third of our total economic growth from 2009 to 2014. American exports are supporting a record number of American jobs, about 11.7 million. TPP was also supporting better paying jobs. Export related jobs typically pay up to 18% more on average than non-export related jobs. And in addition, tariffs faced by U.S. exporters reduce U.S. workers' earnings by up to 12% in manufacturing industries.